Hey, this is four-time Black Belt World Champion Dominica Obelenite. If you guys are looking to level up your jiu-jitsu game with awesome jiu-jitsu courses on mindset, strategy, and beyond, make sure that you guys check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. I myself have a course up there, so make sure you guys check it out. Let's get you guys on that next step in your jiu-jitsu journey.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 203. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach, and today, happy to be joined by Greg Souders. Greg, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, Steve. How about yourself, my man?
Not bad. Thanks so much for coming by, man. You're one of our more frequently requested guests. I've had a whole bunch of people independently say that I need to get you on this show, that the stuff that you're saying is completely aligned with the kind of message that we try to promote. So with that said, though, you're probably better at explaining all this than me. Why don't you just quickly introduce yourself and tell everyone about your work?
Oh, for sure. So my name is Greg Souders. I'm a coach and owner of Standard Jiu-Jitsu in Rockville, Maryland. I guess why people are requesting me on here today is just the training methods we're using in our school are different than what's traditionally being used throughout the jiu-jitsu community. And we feel that the methods we're using to help our students acquire skill and increase motor performance are far better than anything that's being utilized currently.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that to start with here. When you say that the methods that other gyms use are subpar, what exactly do you mean by that? Like, can we describe what the quote unquote regular way of training jiu-jitsu is? And maybe you can start punching some holes in why that method is suboptimal.
Yeah, no problem. So the traditional method would be something like this. A student comes into a school, they do a trial class, and maybe they sign up. And then once they sign up, their first day of class is usually a 20 to 25-minute warm-up where they're running around the gym, they're jumping over each other, they're rolling and shrimping down the mat. And then they circle up and the instructor goes around and explains to them what they're going to be learning today. And then they drill what that thing is statically. They go through a process-oriented, step-by-step approach to learning the skill. And that could last for another 20 minutes. And usually with the last 15 to 20 minutes of class, the students are asked to spar. And that would be your typical class. Now, the issue with that is almost none of it is aligned with how people learn to develop new skills. I mean, warming up, for example, is largely a complete waste of time. Your body doesn't know the difference between rolling, running, jumping, or even just standing in place and shaking furiously. The synovial fluid, the core temperature, your heart rate will all increase no matter what you do. So, rather than wasting, 20, 25 minutes of a class having people doing things that are non-jiu-jitsu related, seems to me to be a waste of the hour, or at least a piece of it. And then to go from the warm-up, you have the explanation of techniques that new students are learning. But the issue is that these new students have no idea what's going on. So to start explaining things to them out of context already puts a strange expectation in the mind as to how the movements should or shouldn't be performed. So it's very disconnected from the reality of actually touching a live resisting body. And then finally, there's very little translation between what the instructor is saying, how they're explaining the technique, and then, of course, free sparring. There's a huge gap between a static drill and a live go. And that gap is rarely ever justified by our modern instructor. So that would be an example of how the traditional practice goes and why I think that those are a few reasons why I think it fails to do its job.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. What you've described here is what on the podcast we sometimes talked about is kind of the three-part traditional class structure, which is if you wander into basically any jiu-jitsu gym in the world, there is a very good chance that their out-of-the-box class structure is going to be a third of the class is some sort of calisthenic warm-up where basically you're doing jumping jacks and stuff like that has minimal, if any, relation to actual jiu-jitsu. And the goal is, in a lot of cases, what they'll say is it's to get your heart warm or you're going or something to that effect. Or maybe they're trying to in some cases, if they think that it's a competition gym, they might even be trying to burn you out before you even start training. Then you get to the technique, which is normally, and again, the next third of the class, that comes down to about, 20, 30 minutes of what I've heard described as dead drilling, which is basically you just repetitively bang off the same pattern over and over again on a non-resisting opponent. And then the last third of the class is the part that everyone actually often wants to do, which is the free rolling. And again, most of the time, no real structure there. Sometimes if your instructor it thinks that they're doing a good job, they might try to impose a constraint. Like they might say, we're starting from guard or something like that. But normally it basically devolves into just regular rolling. And what winds up happening in that case is you've got these three parts, like you said, that are very disconnected, and none of them really consciously serve the purpose of skill development.
For sure.
And of course, the challenge that we have in the jiu-jitsu community is there's a lot of instructors who walk around and talk like, they're the expert in everything, and they will espouse this method just blindly without realizing that there's really no science or evidence to why you should train this way. It's just a tradition, and it's honestly not a very effective tradition at the end of the day either.
100%. I completely agree. I mean, I think a lot of what we do in this sport is just an accident of history. I don't think it really has any objective basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one area where maybe you're spearheading, and I'd love to talk more about this, is how you're bringing jiu-jitsu methods more in line with what other more mature sports would use, where they take a more science-based approach to what works. And I'd love to dig into that. So if we were to deconstruct this, what does your ideal class structure look like? Instead of that classic 3-part model, what do you do at your school?
Well, it's going to depend on the level of student I'm working with, but I always like to talk about the foundations, because without a good foundation, nothing really works well. So for my foundations class, the things that we focus on are what would be the foundational criteria of top and bottom positioning as it relates to both neutrality or neutral positions and dominant positions or pins. And so if you look at jiu-jitsu just as a game, it's only a 3-part game. There's the standing situation, top and bottom, depending on how you guys are orienting before you hit the floor. There's the guarded situation, top or bottom, however you're orienting. And there's the pin situation, top and bottom. Now, I'm holding submissions out of there because these submissions are within the whole game. So I'm just kind of excluding that. So for all the generalized behaviors, again, you have the standing situation, top, bottom, the guarded situation, top, bottom, and the pin situation, top, bottom. And so the behaviors we do in each of these 3 basic situations are going to build the foundation of everything that happens thereafter. So in our basic class, we start off right away with games where the student gets to experience what we would consider to be the foundation of each of those positions. So for example, if we were working, let's say we come in a day and we're working something from the top position. So the 2 foundational measures of top position, no matter what they are stay on top and hold your partner down. So a new student walking in off the street would play a game where the top player would have an objective, focus on some task within jiu-jitsu, where they would be trying to work within a given top position when their main focus would be staying on top and holding their partner down. And then the bottom person would be given an objective to either get off the bottom in some way with some orientation, or they would try to make the top player fall down and become the bottom player. I can get more specific than that, but that would be like a generalized way I could discuss how class would start.
Got it. So yeah, I'd love to dig into a bit more specific. So you mentioned kind of gamification and gamifying the approach, and this is something I've heard a lot of kind of new age instructors talk about. I'd love to dig into that a bit.
For sure. Well, it is a game and you have to play it. Can you imagine going somewhere and saying, I want to learn basketball, and the first thing I did was spent an hour describing to you what basketball is? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Just give the kid a ball and let him put it in the hole against other players. I mean, that's really what all sports are. They're games. So why would we have any interaction in a class where we are not playing a game, even a small aspect of it? So I think that the new modern coach realizes that if in order to learn jiu-jitsu, the student has to play jiu-jitsu. So this is why they create these, or what would academically be considered a small-sided game. And the game itself is what teaches the tactics that emerge from within the grappling system. So as you play the game, behavior emerges, because behavior is an emergent phenomenon when an individual interacts in environments performing tasks. So that's why it's utilized.
Got it. Okay, so maybe some examples. Like I'd love to dig into this, right? You talked about how in a standard class, the experience is going to be you roll in, your instructor gets you to do jumping jacks and shrimp down the mat for 20 minutes or whatever. And then they've got usually 3 moves of the day. They bang off the move and then they say, monkey see, monkey do. And your job as the student is to basically copy and duplicate what your instructor did against a completely non-resisting opponent. And then you go into the last third of the class, which is this part that everyone actually wants to do, which is the rolling. How would your class look different? So if I'm especially a day one white belt, right, I walk into your class, what do I experience?
Well, it depends on what we're learning, but let's use like a whole sequence of events. Let's go from submission to pin. Okay. So typically the first game a student will play, we would call a low variability game. This is an alignment within a given situation where the choices that have to be made are cognitively non-demanding. And I mean, of course, it's cognitively demanding, but what I mean is it's not a very complex series of events. So if we were teaching the mounted position, and we want to ultimately work from staying on top, controlling the mount, working into a given submission, and then finishing that submission. This is something we want to do in a whole class. So we would start with this idea you've probably heard before, which is starting with the end in mind. So we would start the student within a fully locked arm lock, day one, first time they're even touching each other. And the top player's job, of course, me as the coach, I would show them what the arm lock situation is. And I would give them a task. I would say, okay, within this situation, you have a head leg, you have a body leg, and you have a hold of your partner's primary arm, the one that you're attacking. And I'd give them an objective. Top player's job is to hold the primary arm so it can't be moved. You're going to use your head leg to hold your partner down and your body leg to hold your partner down to the floor. So use your legs to hold your partner to the floor, keep their arm connected to you. Don't let them get out of this situation. Go. And we would tell the bottom person, get off the bottom and try to free your arm any way that you can. We hit the clock for 3 minutes and we say, if anyone succeeds or fails, just restart. And then we go. And so day one, the first time they're touching each other, they're engaged in live scenario within something that's relevant to jiu-jitsu, which would be controlling an arm from the arm lock breaking position. And so each student would have 3 minutes within this situation to sort of explore success and failure so they can start developing some physical context for why things are being done.
Got it. And I would say that probably stands in contrast to the way that most classes teach, which is, again, the instructor is going to sit you down and say, here is the arm bar. Here's 10 steps. Follow them exactly. And then everyone gets 2 minutes of drilling that they switch back and forth with their partner, and then you move on to the next thing. In my 13, 14 years of training jiu-jitsu, have never met a student who actually learned effectively using that method, but yet every gym in the world seems to do that, right?
Well, people still do it because you realize it's people that are inefficiently trained fighting against people who are inefficiently trained. One of my students likes to say, we are in the leather helmet phase of our sport. And, even though we're all excited about it and we see all these top guys coming out, they're not performing jiu-jitsu to the level that it should be being performed because we are not all engaged in the same type of practice. It's like if you were to go to a D1 wrestling program, there's going to be no difference between, Cale Sanderson's practice or John Smith's practice. They know the same thing and they're all doing the same physical work largely. Mm-hmm. So you're getting a more pure form of the sport, more emergent form of the sport. And we're just not there yet as a whole in our community. So yeah, absolutely. Everyone, I don't mean to be arrogant about it, but everyone learns the wrong way. Even I did. I learned the wrong way too.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely did. I remember my first class of jiu-jitsu back in 2008. I'd done a bit of research. I discovered the UFC and I thought, what, this BJJ thing seems like a martial art that would speak to me. And I went in and I experienced exactly what you described, where they basically gave me a cardio workout for about 20, 30 minutes. And then they, had me repeat some actions that to this day I don't remember. And then they basically had a bunch of blue belts beat the shit out of me to, I guess, quote unquote, drive the point home, right? And I mean, that's the funny thing is, I think in a lot of ways that's by design, right? Gyms do this because they believe that, well, the best way to demonstrate the power of jiu-jitsu is to put that untrained person in there with a trained person and just let them go and show them how it works.
Well, the best way to show the power of jiu-jitsu is to give someone an opportunity to learn it so they can see the effect their own body has over their opponents. That's what you want the student to do. You want them to be excited about engaging in such a way where they feel like they have control over the person because that's what they came in there for. If they know what jiu-jitsu is, they're like, man, I want to learn this. And letting them know within the first week what it feels like. And that through a task-focused game, you can start implementing these controls or these ideas that you have about what it's like to interact with another person. That's empowering. I mean, especially if you enjoy the sensation.
Yeah. We had Nick Winkelman on the podcast a while ago. He's the author of The Language of Coaching. And what he talked about on that episode was very similar to what you're talking about here, which is to kind of get away from this prescriptive method of coaching where you just tell people what to do and you expect them to follow you like robots, and more.
For sure.
You create a game environment and you give them cues that just helps the body figure out the right thing to do naturally.
For sure.
And that it just seems to be a much more intuitive and effective way to teach people the right way to move their body conceptually versus trying to get them to just effectively copy and paste into their brain what the coach is telling them to do. And that's never going to work.
Well, it's because there is no, quote, right way to move your body. There's only an effective way to move your body. And each person effectively moves their body in different ways. A guy who's 6 feet tall and 180 pounds moves his body relatively differently than someone who's 5'6", 120 pounds. The physical constraints that they're dealing with are different. So the physical manifestations that emerge from these individual systems are going to be different. Like I even go against people when they talk about, quote, details. Like I don't even believe in details. Like everyone's detail for how they accomplish a thing is going to be based on their own individual constraints. And even their psychological constraints, their social constraints. It's all going to change the emergent quality of the behavior. And so we need a room that allows this freedom. I mean, I can't remember who said it, but I've been holding this in my mind for a long time. And they said that the coach only has 2 responsibilities when creating a practice. 1, they need to teach what's invariant. And 2, they need room for self-expression. And so with this ecological approach that we're using for skill acquisition, I feel that we're able to create that quality in our room where we are teaching invariance, but we are giving room for the student to express themselves.
Could you just quickly explain exactly what we mean when we say the ecological approach?
For sure. So ecology is a system, right? So the ecological system is the individual or the organism, you, the task, the thing that the organism is doing within an environment. And this ecological system is a precursor for behavior. So behavior is an emergent quality of the ecological system. So the individual task environment system. And so it's something that naturally emerges, like from, like I said, you performing tasks within the environment. And that's what ecology is. So the ecological approach is that if you give an individual a task within an environment and they start to interact through perception action coupling, through coordination, through attunement, effective movement solutions or effective behavior start to emerge from this interaction.
Got it. And maybe just a quick refresher as well. We did have a previous conversation with Dr. Rob Gray about the perception action coupling, but just as a quick refresher for people who didn't catch that, do you want to give that a quick explanation so people know what we mean by that?
For sure. So perception is just your ability to perceive something within your environment. Action is just what you do in spite of that or as you perceive things, right? So you can imagine if I was in a room and I was walking around and I felt like sitting, I would look for something that looks sittable and then I would take the action of sitting on it. That's perception action coupling as minimally as I can describe it.
Got it. Now, am I correct in understanding then that if we tie all of this together, it sounds like the big change that you're really suggesting is rather than being prescriptive and treating our students like robots, where we basically give them instructions to follow, you're kind of suggesting creating an environment where the right behavior just kind of emerges organically, right? You put some games in place that are designed to steer people to kind of come up with the right movements on their own. Is that sort of the right way to explain this?
In a way, yes, it's simplified, but correct. I mean, that's how all movements have ever emerged. I mean, there's never been anything else other than that. Like you could think of the most complex, crazy jiu-jitsu movement that you can imagine in your head. And there was a time in history where that happened with no instruction. So if we understand that historically behaviors emerge, regardless how complex people argue they are, if they are a natural emergent quality of the task environment individual system, then why would we think that a new student could access this skill in any other way if that's how it was originally accessed?
Yeah. Now, what a lot of, gray-haired black belts will say is, well, this all sounds well and good, but hey, I watch those white belts and I know that they do everything wrong. So that's why I like to sit them down and walk them through the 10 proper steps to do an arm bar. This is for a reason because I know they're going to make these mistakes and I want to cut that off at the gate. I mean, how would you counter that argument when you hear that?
Well, that's to assume that they understand optimization, that they know exactly what is right. And I mean, think about it. If you look at basketball in 1940, okay, they're dribbling like 5-year-old children, right? And at the time, that was right. They had competitive games. But if LeBron James played one of those fools now, it would look ridiculous, right? So if we think we know a thing and a time, it's arrogant. I mean, we need things to emerge on their own over time historically to see what truly is this idea of, quote, optimization. And so, yeah, for some, like you said, gray-haired old black belt to be like, no, this is the only right way to do it. He's just a fool. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I mean, as well as I do, we all battle with this. There is something about having to put on that black belt and get up in front of the room that kind of instills in you a false sense of confidence and probably makes you feel like you know more than you do. And especially when you can go in there and you can just tune up all of the white belts, right? Yeah, it feels like you know what you're doing. But just because you're ahead of the people that you're training with who are more junior, that doesn't mean your method is optimal, right? And so I think that sometimes coaches, especially black belts, tend to be pretty overconfident in their methods just because their thought is, well, it worked for me and everyone else does it, so clearly this is the way to do it. But I think that there is that degree of arrogance that comes along with that. You know, the black belt is a symbol, and that symbol can get to your head if you let it. And I think that's an important thing to consider when it comes down to keeping an open mind to these new methods.
Oh, for sure. I mean, everyone resists change. You know, like we don't teach moves, like, and you wouldn't believe what my students can do. Like we don't teach, I literally don't show them anything. I found a way to create practice where nothing has to be shown. The only things I explain are the tasks or the concepts behind how and why we're engaging. And my students can do very complex behaviors. Like I keep bringing this kid up, and I cannot wait for the world to see this kid. This kid named Noah Schaffner. He's a blue belt. He's been training for 1 year and 8 months. And when I say this, I'm not kidding. I can be attested to many people. He beats visiting black belts easily. Like it's not even difficult for him. And he's never learned a move, and he's never drilled. He can wrestle, he can pass, he can backtake, he can sweep, he can submit. And he's never once practiced any of those moves in the traditional sense. And there's a reason why we do it this way too. It's not just like, oh yeah, drilling works and then this other thing works too. It's that, no, what we want a skill to be is flexible and adaptable. And the way we acquire the skill will determine whether it's flexible or adaptable. So if we acquire a skill in a process-oriented way, the skill is not robust and flexible. It's very rigid and very stereotypical. If a skill is allowed to emerge in its own based on a variety or variability, then it's not as easily perturbed by changes in the environment. And the student generally has a better understanding of what's happening because they didn't learn it from me. They learned it from themselves. So self-discovery, really.
Yeah. And I love that bit of guidance here because something that I think a lot of beginners get misled about is this feeling that, you know, I can't do it the way that my coach taught me, so therefore I'm just not good at jiu-jitsu,
well, sure.
Which is very much a fallacy, right? I mean, I remember being told from like beginner days that here's how you do a triangle choke. And if you can't do this, you're just not following the instructions correctly. And that doesn't take into account the fact that, look, we all have very different body types, right? I mean, I'm like 5'7", 5'8", close to 200 pounds. I'm built like a dwarf from Lord of the Rings, right? My legs are short and really, really thick. There's a lot of moves I can do where I can capitalize on that body type, but a triangle choke is not one of those. Like even against a regular sized human being, I can barely close a triangle, even if they're letting me do it. It's just a body type thing. And by trying to follow the instructions for so long, all I really achieved rather than developing the skill was kind of just feeling bad about myself because I couldn't do what my coach wanted me to do because they weren't taking into account that I'm a different person from who they are.
For sure. It's because they have no idea how to do their job. You have to realize that most teachers aren't teachers. They're just business owners who call themselves teachers and coaches. Coaching, communicating with others and helping others acquire skill is a skill itself. So these guys don't practice that. You know, they practice this strange form of business ownership egotism. Like it's wild. Like it frustrates me so bad. I mean, I have a lot of visitors come into my school from local academies. People who've been training for 10 plus years, and they're so terrible at grappling that I feel bad for them. It's like I want the other schools around me to not even call what they're doing jiu-jitsu. Like I made a joke, they should call it cardio grappling or whatever. Because man, these instructors have no idea how to do their job.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the interesting schism in like Krav Maga, right? Where, you know, people, yes, there are legit Krav schools out there where you can get realistic self-defense training, but there's like a 99% chance that the Krav school down the block is basically some variant of cardio kickboxing self-defense, right? There is a schism there.
Well, there's no objective measure for who can open a school and what they're teaching. It's just anyone can. So there's no mechanism to weed out the crap. You know?
Yeah. And you bring up one of my favorite talking points in jiu-jitsu. You know, you mentioned how a lot of these people, they're not really trained coaches. They're just business owners. I would go even further and say they're not even business owners. They're just competitive grapplers who needed to find a way to pay the bills. And the easiest way to do that was to open a gym, right?
You know, I would agree.
Yeah, most people in jiu-jitsu, and this is an area where I think the youth of our sport still shows compared to some of the other sports, there isn't really a coaching track. There's like this expectation that, well, if you're not an ace competitor, why should I listen to you, right? The idea being that, I just don't get it, but the idea being that in order to be a great coach, you must have been previously a great competitor. But the one thing that comes up repeatedly is like, these are very different skill acquisition tracks, and one does not equate to the other.
They're wildly different. I mean, like I had a 5-year competition career. I broke my neck in 2008 and damaged my spinal cord. Like I had to stop. I just had 3 black belts win pans easily. Do you know what I mean? Like it's crazy. John Danaher, he doesn't compete, never competed once in his life. I competed more than John Danaher. You know what I mean? I was at least at a purple belt competing at the world level, but either way, it has nothing to do with my skill to coach. And it's just people want to feel good about whoever their like self, their perceived superhero is. My coach is a world champion. But I want my students to say my coach makes world champions. You know what I mean? So there's a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So question for you here. I mean, we're talking about different ways that we can organize a class, and I would be curious to get your feedback on, does this vary from a beginner versus an advanced student? Are there ways that you would introduce this model differently depending on the student's existing experience?
Well, yes and no. So like I said, when you deal with new people, all you have to do is make sure the variability is generally low. Now, variability is a good thing. Okay. There's something that we know called the variability effect of practice. And this is the idea that through variability, the brain kind of stays in this novel state where it pays attention to everything. And it seems like when the person's experiencing it, it feels confusing and difficult. But for some reason, our mind likes that variation. And when variability of practice is studied, that it shows that the information retention and transfer tests is superior to things that are repeated over and over and over again. So anyway, so variability is a good thing, but typically you don't want too much. If variability is too high, it's too overwhelming. It'd be like lifting a very heavy weight. Like if you wanted to start squatting, you don't put your 105% 1 rep max to start learning. That's too much. So you need to introduce a certain amount of challenge to the system. So yeah, for brand new people, low variability. And for people who are experienced, they tend to be the complete opposite. I mean, I'm talking high variability. We'll change task focus every 10 minutes. And we could be wildly different task focuses. We could go from starting in a submission to starting on the feet, playing first to score, or even more complex than that.
Yeah. I think kind of the point you're getting at here is there's no right or wrong answer to the difference between a beginner or an advanced student. It's all about basically managing that dial so you're giving them just enough variability to keep them engaged and thinking, but not so much variability that they go into cognitive overload.
Correct. I mean, just yep.
Yeah. Awesome. That makes a ton of sense. And that kind of aligns with just general life experience, I think. I mean, if you do anything repetitively enough, your brain eventually just goes on autopilot because, okay, I know the motion. I know that the next 10 reps that I do are going to be the same as the one I just did. So eventually your brain can kind of just turn off and you can just go onto autopilot. And a little bit of variability prevents that from happening, right? So I can see why that would be beneficial.
I mean, your brain literally turns off once it starts feeling comfortable with what it's doing. They've done fMRI studies where activity goes down the more familiar you are with the thing. So we want to keep things novel. Novelty is a good thing. It's just about managing that novelty, though. You don't want things too novel because then it's just chaos. So I think there is a happy medium.
Got it. Now, something that we've discussed on the show before is this idea of interleaving, where you basically shake up the training practice a bit so that you're not just doing the same thing over and over and over again. I would say that this is probably a different approach from what most jiu-jitsu gyms use, right? Most jiu-jitsu gyms that I know, they'll be like, this week is guard week, and we're just going to show a whole bunch of slight variants of basically the same thing over and over again.
For sure.
I'd love to know over a longer window of time, like over weeks or months or quarters, how do you structure your programs? Do you guys use interleaving in any way?
Oh, 100%, man. So our week goes like this: top, and next week bottom, top, bottom, top, bottom, top, and bottom. And we always go neutral pin, neutral pin, neutral pin. Okay. So like week 1 would be like, let's say top close guard. Next week 2 would be bottom close guard. Week 3 would be top mount. Week 4 would be bottom mount. And this is just an example. But here's the thing: in each class, right? So let's say we're on a week where we're working from the top of the mounted position. Halfway through the class, I'll switch to something we did 3 weeks before. So it'll be like, okay, we're working, staying on top and holding your partner down from the mounted position, or we're working, stay on top, hold your partner down, and put one of the arms into a state of extension or contraction, right? So it'll be like some basic task like that. And then, like I said, 20 minutes in, 25 minutes in, we'll be like, all right, guys, now we're going to start on our partner's back. All right. Or I'll be like, okay, guys, we're going to have a belly up guard player and we have a standing passer. Standing passer get past bottom player's legs and try to achieve chest-to-chest contact. Go. So every day we play the whole game of jiu-jitsu, right? So no matter what the primary task focus is, the primary intention of the practice, we interleave previous lessons within that hour window. And so this is called contextual interference. So it's what causes the variability effect. So when you break up the context and you interfere with a person's thinking, it reintroduces novelty. And so, we use it heavily.
Got it. Makes a ton of sense. Now, when a teacher is trying to deploy something like this, an argument I often hear against this kind of approach is, but it sounds like so much work, and that kind of makes sense, right? Because the traditional method of 3 techniques a day, basically where the coach just pulls 3 techniques out of his ass and teaches them, that's easy. And I've heard this complaint about the reverse classroom model as well, which is, but how can a coach be reasonably expected to pay attention to all of their students and provide individual training? I just can't do it. I'm guessing that you've heard the same thing, right?
Well, yeah, you can't. So first of all, a generalized approach goes a long way. Like you have to understand that most students in a room aren't going to be students for a long period of time. So this is something we have to understand to be true. Okay, most students they want to exercise, they want to get away from their wife for an hour, and they just want to do it twice a week. So a generalized approach is completely fine. You don't have to start getting specific with a student until years down the road, really. I say 2-3 years in until we have to start touching on specificity. So, and also you don't need to hold hands. The body self-organizes around the task. So if your practice is intelligently designed, where the student knows what the demands of practice are and they know what their intention is and they know where to focus their attention, they can do trial and error on their own. Once they start learning how to learn, the coach basically doesn't really need to be there. And so the idea that this coach is an invisible hand over their student dictating every action, that's silly. That's silly. It's unnecessary. I barely speak to my basic students. I barely say anything to them. You know what I mean? The only time I reach in and correct is when they're not following the task goals. That's all. Because beginners will get chaotic. They will respond to their emotions. They will respond to their confusions. And they'll start making up their own games. So I have to stop and be like, hey, you're not staying within the constraints of the situation. Try to refocus, let's try again. But there's, you can't talk to everybody. And no coach can talk to everybody. We would need 30 coaches,
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a question I've got for you about something you mentioned earlier about how you barely teach moves. You're not the only person I've heard talk about that. I mean, I know Chris Paynes is very big into that. There's a lot of instructors now who are moving more towards the approach that you're espousing. But what does a class look like? I mean, I think someone who follows the traditional model, to say, I run a class without teaching moves sounds like it should be just impossible. I mean, isn't there some point which you've got to actually sit people down and say, okay, here are the actual steps for this technique? Or do you just skirt that entirely and just let everything emerge organically?
No, there's, first of all, there are no steps to a move. They're zero. Like the whole step-by-step process is silly, right? The only time a step-by-step process is even discussed is if it's an invariant property of the exchange, right? So let's say there's a generalized approach to guard passing, right? So the generalized approach to guard passing is stay on top, hold your partner down, segment the periphery, and gain access to center mass. So every guard pass you've ever heard of or ever seen follows that process. They're making choices and taking action to stay on top and hold their partner down. And they're trying to segment the periphery and then applying weight to center mass to hold it still. Okay, so moves emerge from that interaction. So for example, a knee cut emerged as a movement during segmentation where somebody was creating a bodily shape where they went in between their partner's knees to segment the body and gain access to center mass. Quote unquote Toreando pass, it was the opposite. It was a series of movements that was undertaken while the top player was holding their partner down, staying on top, segmenting the legs to the outside so they could gain access to their partner's hips and shoulders and gain access to center mass. So this idea is that if you teach the process, the foundational process by which all guard passes occur, guard passes start to emerge. I haven't taught a single guard pass in 6 years. Not one. And all of my black belts pass everyone's guard that they touch.
So this is an interesting realization that I've had, I think, especially as I get older. I find myself now in a situation where I can barely recall any jiu-jitsu techniques at all. And I find this kind of embarrassing sometimes because people will say things like, well, Steve, how do you do this particular technique? And I have to say, like, I don't really know. All I know is that I know how to move in the right way in the moment and the good thing happens, right? I find this approach of trying to prescribe these 10 invariable steps of how to do a move is not really that productive because like you kind of implied earlier, jiu-jitsu is not an invariable sport. It's a very variable sport, right? You've got this person training with you who is trying to do everything they can to screw up your game and to win. And you have no control over what they're going to choose to do. There's massive variability. This is not gymnastics where your goal is to execute a perfect routine over and over again. There is massive variability in fight sports. And so trying to duplicate techniques the way that you saw it on the DVD, that's just not a good approach to skill acquisition because that never happens in the wild.
Well, it doesn't even happen for the person doing the technique they're putting on the DVD.
Yeah.
No technique that any student has shown on DVD have they done the same way twice ever because it can't. Even a slight variation in the elbow angle or the shoulder angle or the way they applied weight. See, a long time ago, there was a guy named Nikolai Bernstein who came up with this thing called the degrees of freedom problem. And it was that how we saw that this was a thing and then coined it as the degrees of freedom problem is he was studying blacksmiths. And he found out something really strange. So novice blacksmiths were very consistent in their swing, very consistent. There was almost no variability, but very inconsistent in their conclusion. Whereas elite blacksmiths who were at their highest level of their abilities had tons of variation within their swing, but their conclusion was very consistent. So he said, how is it possible that the swing variability, even though it was there was lots of it, but they still had the same conclusion? So it's this idea that the body has this noise in the system based on how many different ways the arm can articulate to accomplish the task. And elite level people this noise doesn't bother them. They don't care where their arm is. They have some way to self-organize around what their conclusion is. So this variation is accepted and allowed to exist within the system. And so to try to erase this variability by forcing a student into a step-by-step stereotypical process, you take away the beauty of variation. You take away the thing that's going to happen naturally anyway. No two instances in anyone's life are ever the same. And even in sport, it's the same thing. And so we have to understand that this is true about the human movement system. And we have to allow it to exist. And we have to take it into account when creating practices.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up here then. How do you feel about really rigid testing systems? Because I was just talking to someone the other day who was telling me that, okay, and before I'm going to give out a belt, I'm going to make the person demonstrate that they can perfectly execute these 100 techniques, and it's all documented and written down. Do you think there's a place for that, or is that just kind of steering in the wrong direction?
It's completely steering in the wrong direction. I mean, this whole obsession with rank is just, it's beyond me. Like, I don't know what people are trying to do. It's not objective anyway. Why do you need to know a certain set of techniques, right? Why can't we just see, is this person an effective grappler? There's no ranks in wrestling. You know what I mean? Like, why do we need ranks here? And why are we obsessed over it? I mean, of course, I give ranks. Don't get me wrong. But our ranks are based on performance. It's not based on things you remember. You know what I mean? So I don't know why people want to do this. I think maybe they want to control their environment too much, or they want to solidify their space in the coaching world so they feel like they have a reason to get up in the morning. I don't know. Like, to me, it's just, it really does a disservice to the student, and it's dishonest and disingenuous.
Yeah, this is something I've observed a lot of coaches do. And frankly, even coaches that I really like, who I think generally do a pretty good job. But I've seen them all make this mistake where students, even very experienced students, will start to get creative and they'll start to figure out things that work for themselves. And then the coach will try to shut it down because they'll be like, well, look, yeah, sure, maybe you figured out a way to make it work, but I don't think you should do that technique because that's not how Helio taught us to do it, right? You know, sure, you're doing what you're doing. You might be winning tournaments with it, but that's not actual jiu-jitsu the way that the masters defined it, right? Which is a totally bullshit made up goal that has no value, right? Either it works or it doesn't. We tell our students this: rightness is a scale, okay? At the bare minimum, you have to be effective. And then the more consistently you can be effective, at a low energy cost in a timely manner, you start transitioning to the other side of it, which we call efficient. So there's this gap that you can exist in and still be right. And I think, creativity is a beautiful thing. I mean, because this is how new movement patterns emerge, right? So, we need to let our students do this. I think a lot of coaches have this ego where they want to always be the coach. Now, I don't have this ego because, I tell my students, man, be as creative as you want, but I'm going to fuck you up until you beat me.
So, but you can be whoever you want, be whoever you want, but I'm never going to stop you. But your goal is to beat me. Your goal is to rise above me. And so I think a lot of coaches just don't want that to be the case.
Now, a lot of people are going to listen to this and they're probably going to say, hey, this all sounds awesome. I want to start putting this into practice. The problem is my coach is a 6-stripe black belt from Rio who believes strongly in traditional methods, and he's not going to listen to anything I say. What do you do if you're that student and you train in a gym that is actively against methods like this? I mean, I guess the obvious answer is you can change gyms, but sometimes for a lot of reasons that might not be realistic, right? So, I mean, what do you do if you are the kind of the black sheep in the family and you're the only one who believes in these methods?
Okay, you take your couch out of your living room, buy some mats, and get 4 of your cool friends to come over and train with you and do it yourself. I mean, the thing is you don't need some jiu-jitsu Jesus, who runs a gym telling you what to do. If you really want to learn this yourself, you can learn this yourself. I mean, I haven't been coached by a coach since 2013, and I've completely changed my perspective and paradigm. The things I can do now in my own personal jiu-jitsu far exceed what I could do then. And most of them were developed through my own methodology, things that I discovered by myself. And so another reason I want to do these podcasts, other than, of course, to get our school some exposure and get people to come train with us, is to give the students their power back. Like, you can do this yourself, man. You got to do some education. You got to do the hard reading. But, once you understand the method, you now have access to true skill acquisition, and you don't need to pay fealty to some, school owner lord who's trying to control you and make you do things their way.
Yeah. And I think there is a benefit that probably school owners don't see to using this approach as well, which is that I know that as a black belt, it often feels like, okay, you're expected to know everything and be able to do everything and be able to answer everything and be able to beat everyone on the mats. But that's not a realistic or even healthy expectation. And as the black belt in the room, it's very liberating when you realize that you're not expected to be perfect, right? The students can take ownership of their own learning journey. You're there to facilitate, like you said, you're there to be a guide, but you're not necessarily there to be the font of knowledge who has all of the answers. And it's very liberating when you can accept that and realize that, okay, I'm not the boss of these people. They're all grown adults. They all can take care of their own journey. I'm just here to be the guide, to be the coach. I find that can take a lot of stress off your shoulders when you accept that mindset.
Well, yeah, I mean, if that's what your goal is. I mean, my goal is just to help people learn jiu-jitsu. So I'm going to do that in the best way possible. I'm going to keep reading and researching and figure out how to do it. So far, so good. I think I have a strong method and a good way to do that. But that's my concern, right? So when you open a school, I mean, I don't know how people can take people's money and not do their job. Like if I want to get my computer fixed and I drop it off at Geek Squad to fix my computer, and I get it back and you messed it up, I'm not going to pay you any money. But, students are willing to pay hundreds of dollars for years at a time to be told to run around and shrimp up and down the mat and have no real jiu-jitsu. And then they do this for 16 years because they, listen to the whole traditional model, and they come into my school and get trounced by a blue belt who's been training for a year. That's terrible. So, Yeah, man, I want to save people from that horrible end.
It's interesting you bring this up. I'm pretty sure I've brought this up about 100 times on the podcast recently, but I'm going to do it again because it's pretty near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
I hate that shrimp down the mat drill. In the bump, the big bump explosions, because that's how I quote unquote warmed up in jiu-jitsu for basically my entire career. And as a result, I didn't realize until around brown or maybe even black belt that I sucked at shrimping and I sucked at bumping, because the way that you do it during a warm up and a drill is very different from the way you do it in a live roll, right? Oh. If your instructor tells you, hey, you got to shrimp down the mat, you're going to be doing these big, explosive, long shrimps because your goal is you got to cover distance, right? You got to get your ass down the mat. That's not how you actually shrimp effectively in a real fight. If you do big, explosive movements, you create big, explosive openings for your opponent. So good shrimping is often much more controlled than what you do during the drill.
But forget the problem, even I'm here you talk about it now, is you're focused on your own movement. Your movement is only relative to who and what you're doing it against. So a quote shrimp isn't even a thing, right? I don't even know. I can't tell you the last time I showed somebody a shrimp. 2009, maybe? How people remove themselves from underneath a weighted player is to control inside position, is to know how to utilize their frames to create space for movement. And so shrimping is nothing, all right? Teaching people what it means to structure yourself in what we would call inside position for the purpose of space creation and movement is the skill. The shrimp is just what it looks like, Yeah, so it's a completely ineffective way to teach somebody emotion because it's called decoupled. Okay, so something that is not linked by perception and action is a decoupled skill, meaning it was not developed in the situation under which it would be used. Okay, it's not, quote, representative of the situation in which it needs to be formed.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, for the people out there listening to this, I'm sure that there's going to be some black belts who decide, or maybe they've already decided and they just don't know how to do it, that they want to start implementing some of these practices into their gym. And I would love to know, okay, if you're on board with this idea, but you don't even know where to start, maybe you've got an existing gym or an existing practice, what are the first big wins that you could start implementing to really start putting together this approach in play?
Listen, I'm gonna tell you guys the truth. This is hard work. Like, I've been working at this for 8 years. I have read 20 books easily. And not only that, is some of this material is still in the academic phase. So trying to get through these technical articles is not easy. And then not to mention, I now have to try to apply it. And I have to use trial and error just like you do when you're learning jiu-jitsu. And so the coaches who are listening to these podcasts and trying to find some magic bullet, buddy, you're not going to find it. You're going to have to do the work just like I did. Or you can contact me and I can give you a shortcut. But no, I'm being serious. My phone has been going nuts. Like, I have been call after call, Instagram message, and I try to interact with everyone that I can. I believe in the concept of mutual benefit. So I'm trying to increase the standards under which practice is utilized in our community. So, if you really need help and you want to know the deal, contact me, man. I'm talking to everyone about this thing. And the truth is that's really what I want to do. I want to be a coach's coach. Like, I want to be at the forefront of this movement, and I want to help people get rid of some of these, psychological demons they have about why this, isn't working, isn't right. And I don't want them to listen to Reddit and all these other silly ass places that tell people that, they really know what's going on when they actually don't. So yeah, I can recommend books if you want, but again, you're going to have to educate yourself in order to utilize this approach.
Yeah. I would love that. I would say, why don't we recommend some resources that you found that are really good? And also let's plug how people can contact you. I'd love to know how people can get in touch if they do want to work with you, or if they've just got questions they need to field.
Well, for sure. You can always contact me at greg@standardjiu-jitsu.com. That's my email. My Facebook is @GDSouders or @standardjiu-jitsu. I control everything, so you can reach out to me. The number on my website is mine, so contact me, text me, call me. I don't care. I do what I can to help people around me. But the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to start learning what the ecological approach is. There is a new book that just came out called An Introduction to Ecological Psychology. I actually just picked it up. A buddy of mine, Scott Saveright from the Primal MMA podcast, who was the first guy to actually reach out to me and put me on, he introduced me to this book, even though I think I have a generally good understanding of the ecological approach, but it's good. You should check it out. I just picked it up. You can also, the guy you had on there, Rob Gray, that you had on your show, this guy is not known enough and he needs to be known. He's an amazing professor at Arizona State University, and he just gives out tons of free information on the ecological approach. He does article reviews, and he really goes out of his way to help people try to understand this through his YouTube channel. So, it's academic and it's tough to get through, but it's worth it. And so that's a nice starting point. And I've got more, but those are good.
Awesome. Yeah, Rob Gray is a guy I definitely recommend people check out if they haven't. He's actually got a new book out called How We Learn to Move, which is probably, I'm going to guess, an amazing fantastic resource. We've actually been talking about getting him back onto the podcast again at some point to go over that material. But yeah, he's also got a great podcast. And again, I'll put all of the links to all of this in the show notes. So if you are listening and you're overwhelmed by all of the resources being thrown at you, just pop open the show notes. It'll have the link to Greg, the link to all of these resources, the link to Rob Gray's stuff, and hopefully that'll be helpful. But Greg, man, beyond that, any other things that you recommend, like anything you wanted to get into here that we didn't talk about today, which you think would be quick wins?
I don't know. There's lots of stuff, actually. I feel like we just kind of philosophized about the shitty nature of jiu-jitsu politics and coaching. I don't think we got into the specifics too much. The kind of thing that I'm really trying to share is that this idea is that jiu-jitsu is not a move-based activity. Jiu-jitsu is a philosophy that guides the grappling art that we do. Okay, so grappling is the activity, jiu-jitsu is the philosophy. And then our practice should represent this. The way that we approach practice is not by teaching moves, but by teaching foundational exchanges or invariant exchanges that happen when anyone touches another body. And trying to get a good technical understanding of what that is I think our job as coaches. Like, we have to be masters of our subject matter. And our subject matter has to be something beyond a collection of moves. It has to be an understanding how two bodies interact, both physically and psychologically, so that we can understand exactly what's happening. Because if we understand this, then it becomes easier to design practice. Just as if you were to teach someone to grow muscle, you have to understand how hypertrophy works. And if we don't understand that, then growing muscle just becomes an exercise of utility, just as teaching jiu-jitsu would be if you don't understand how two bodies interact in our sport. And I think largely they don't. Like even watching PANS this weekend, I was surprised at how poor everyone's guard passing is, for example, or even the utilization of their guard at the black belt level. It's tremendous. And so, we owe our community a greater service at really understanding what the hell we're talking about and doing.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that most coaches out there and most gym owners would probably benefit from putting at least a bit of time and attention into developing their actual coaching skills, right? I mean, I know how much time and attention jiu-jitsu people put into things like tape study and buying and reviewing and trying to process and absorb instructional material. But at the end of the day, coaching is a skill and it needs to be absorbed and learned like a skill. And I would suggest that spending some time specifically studying the art of coaching, even coaching from other sports, in fact, maybe particularly coaching from other sports because they're more developed, probably going to be one of the best things you can do for your gym if you're an instructor.
No, I completely agree, and hopefully I can start to get more platforms to speak on. We're trying to develop stuff now. We're working in house, trying to do little videos and little guides, not on technique, of course, but on the process of coaching and how to better help students acquire skills and increase motor performance. I mean, because that's really what we want to do at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, this has very much been kind of a staple of how we structured this product, right? I mean, we are famously audio only. We've really never produced and published a quote unquote video instructional. And that's very much by design, because the one thing that I love about audio as a medium is you have to think and explain things, right? I can't just show a video of myself doing a knee cut pass and say, see everybody, copy that. Just do it like I did it, right? If I'm gonna explain something through audio, I have to explain it in such a way that the other person can reassemble the whole idea in their own brain, right? They can't just watch what I do and copy and duplicate it. And so I find that when it comes to conceptual thinking, audio is just a beautiful medium for teaching people. So that's why we do things this way, right? I love new age approaches like this that just take a more nuanced approach to teaching rather than just yet another jiu-jitsu instructional on some technique that you'll probably honestly never remember or apply.
Well, for sure. And I think we need to take an even more radical approach to how we're looking at the physics of jiu-jitsu themselves and actually what's happening and distilling things down to their most fundamental engagements. I mean, like, for example, guard work can be boiled down into making and maintaining connections for the purpose of controlling distance, for the purpose of destabilization. So everything you've ever seen emerge from a guarded situation has those three foundations in mind. So if with your guard, if you can't make and maintain connections for the purpose of controlling distance and destabilization, and you don't know what that means, then you don't have a true guard skill. If your guard is made up of barambolos and kisses of the dragons, then even though you can do them, this doesn't mean you understand guard work. Like the beauty of the way we acquire skill is I can look at one of my blue belts and I can be like, you see that move right there that you saw on that DVD, the Kiss the Dragon? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, go do that. And they'll do it immediately, And the reason is they understand how to make and maintain connections for the purpose of controlling distance and destabilization. And they understand these as concepts, not as step-by-step processes. So they understand the function of their tools as they're engaging with their opponent. And this is something that I think our community is not doing well. I mean, like, for example, we talk about the poor guard work that you see even at the black belt level. The guard is by nature a defensive structure. And so what you do see emerge well is strong defensive guard work, because even if two people know nothing about guard work, because they're receiving pressure from the top player, it's going to self-organize around preventing chest to chest or chest to back contact. And it's going to organize around not letting people pass your legs. But when you want to take a defensive structure and you want to reorient it to be a progressive structure where now you can manipulate the physics of your opponent's body, this is something that's not well understood. Like you don't see it happen when you see that, oh, this guy's a good leg locker. No, man, he's only a good leg locker because the top guy has no idea how to deal with it. And he's so afraid that he's falling down and giving people their legs. So anyway, this is something I think needs to be fixed too.
Awesome. Well, a lot of work to be done, but man, Greg, thanks so much for dropping all of these ideas. I really appreciate it. And like I said, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to reach out to you or check out these resources. So I will load up the show notes, make it easy for everyone to grab those. As always, also in the show notes, I'll drop a link to BJJ Mental Models Premium. We talked about this a bit, but the approach that I always love is concepts, audio, storytelling as a medium. One of my favorite ways to teach jiu-jitsu. That's what BJJ Mental Models Premium is all about. We've got far more structured course-style conversations on there. Hundreds of people already subscribed. Great service. Beyond just the course material, we've also got our amazing review and coaching service. You get unlimited access to that. It's a great deal, so please do check it out. First week is free. BJJMentalModels.com if you haven't already gone there to get it. Again, that's BJJMentalModels.com, and I'll also, like I said, toss that link in the show notes. But Greg, thanks a lot, man. This was a fantastic chat. Loved it. Loved the ideas. And man, I'm looking forward to seeing what you produce next.
Oh, for sure, man. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate the exposure, and hopefully we both benefit from this conversation.
No worries, man. And thanks to everyone else listening. Greatly appreciate your time and attention as well. And we'll talk to you next week. See you soon.